Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this A-level religious studies revision video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we are taking a look at the problem of evil and suffering. So we'll be looking at what the problem actually is, how evil and suffering present a problem for theists, how Christians are confronted with the problem of evil and suffering. We'll be looking particularly at the logical and evidential problems, and then we'll be looking at the theodicies that are proposed to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with belief in the Christian God. And we'll be looking at three theodicies in particular, three different defenses: the free will defense, the soul-making theodicy, and then we'll be looking at process theology as well. So this is for the AQA A-level in religious studies, and this is for paper 1, philosophy of religion. So let's get started, shall we? Make sure you've got your snacks ready. I've got a green tea on the go. I may have to go and find some Maltesers or something, but let's get started, shall we? We're going to cover everything you need to know for an A star. So let's get that A star in this topic, should we? Let's go. First of all, I've got to tell you, if you would like to get your own copy, get yourself a copy of this PowerPoint, I should say, then you are very welcome to do so. It's 47 slides long. I know, very exciting. And if you just head over to the website, the link's in the video description box below. And you can print this off, use this as part of your ongoing revision for paper 1. So, as I say, this is paper 1. We are looking at evil and suffering. There will be some good opportunities for synoptic links here, especially actually to paper 2, the study of Christianity, when we're talking about God, for example, certainly when we're talking about process theology, and we'll be able to make some links to other topics and other scholars that we have been studying for this A-level, which is always great. Our key terms today then are, first of all, moral evil, and they are acts committed by human beings, such as murder, theft, and rape. It can also refer to evil that comes from human inaction. For example, when you don't help someone, so when you consciously choose to not act, that could also be seen as moral evil. So a nice link to ethics there when we talk about acts and omissions. You know, is it just as bad to not help someone as it is to actively harm them? Interesting ethical question. Natural evil then, that is suffering caused by nature, the natural world, for example, disease, starvation, storms, floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis. This is usually seen as being produced by the chance operation of the laws of nature. So a flood does not intend or choose to drown you. You know, it's not a calculated thing. It just happens. And we'll be looking at the difference between moral evil and natural evil in terms of how theists make sense of them. You know, is it easier to explain moral evil as the result of free will, for example, whereas natural evil is a bit more difficult to reconcile with belief in a Christian God who is supposedly knowable through the natural world. You know, natural theology, we've studied that when we talked about the design argument, haven't we? You know, and we've said God can be known through nature. Well, if nature is so cruel and causes so much harm, what kind of God are we actually believing in? Suffering then is a mental or physical pain, hardship, or distress brought about by both moral and natural evil. The fall, this is very important for a traditional understanding of natural evil. It is the moment in Genesis when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, and as a result, sin enters the world. There is a disharmony, there is a disconnect between heaven and earth, which results in natural and moral evil. And we'll be looking at how the fall has been blamed by scholars such as Augustine for the existence of natural evil. And then original sin. This is associated with St. Augustine, and it's the doctrine that as a result of that fall in Genesis, all humans are born innately sinful. We inherit a tendency to sin. We are born sinful, and therefore we need salvation. We need to be saved by God through Jesus's death and resurrection. So they are our first key terms. Just a couple more. A theodicy, and we're going to be looking at 3 today, is a philosophical defense of God, of God's goodness, power, and even existence in the face of the reality of evil. So when I use the word theodicy, it's quite a fancy term, isn't it? I like to use it when I'm at dinner, impress people. And it literally just means a defense of God. That's all it means. So yeah, Great one to chuck in there if you want to impress your parents. Epistemic distance. This simply means a distance of knowledge. Yeah, we've studied epistemology, haven't we, already for this A level? We know that's the study of knowledge. And epistemic distance is a distance of knowledge. The world operates in such a way that humans cannot know from it that there is a God. And so there is this gap in our knowledge and understanding. And we'll talk about that a lot when we talk about John Hick. Universalism, the belief that ultimately all humans will be saved and enjoy eternity with God. So no matter what pain and suffering you're going through now, ultimately there will be salvation. There will be reward, if you like, for enduring it. Causal determinism, then, the idea that every event is caused by preceding events and conditions them by the laws of nature. Therefore, humans do not have free will. So we'll be talking about the free will defense first in terms of our theodicies. That will be relevant. Also, something you'll be familiar with if you are studying psychology as well. Process theology, this is really interesting. And as I say, we've come across this on paper too. So it's the rejection of that traditional belief in God, the rejection of that idea that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. It's the idea that the universe and God are both uncreated and eternal. So the universe and God exist together, if you like. God is described as the soul of the universe. And so the universe is in God and God is in the universe. They have what we call a panentheistic relationship, but more on that to come. And we'll be asking, is that a Christian understanding of God? Is that compatible with what we read in the Bible, for example? And then the soul-making theodicy. This is John Hick's big moment to shine, and it is the belief that the world is a veil of soul-making. Evil and suffering are required in order to enable spiritual growth. We are not born fully perfected. We need to then encounter evil and suffering in order to grow from it and to perform good works in response to it. So, who are the main scholars we're going to be meeting today? Let's say hello to them, shall we? They are all men. As we do know from our study of philosophy, traditionally, you know, it has been dominated by men. So here they are. We've got St. Augustine, very important, very interesting ideas. We'll also meet St. Irenaeus, who disagreed with him very significantly. We'll be talking about John Hick, a Roman Catholic theologian. We'll meet John Mackie, David Griffin, who'll be talking a lot about process theology, D.Z. Phillips, and also Alvin Plantinga. Now, we'll also be meeting some other scholars as well, but they're sort of our headliners today. You know, they are on the main stage at this festival. So keep them in mind, and we will be talking about their ideas. Just as always, please remember at A level, you do need to use your scholars. You need to refer to them. Ideally, refer to a scholar in every paragraph in order to secure that A star. We cannot get away with writing. Some Christians believe, some theists think, you know, we need to ground everything we write in our scholars, in their books, in their work. And I'm going to give you all that you need to know about each of these scholars in this video today. So do not worry. So I wanted to just start with a little question and some images on the screen for you here. And my question is this: in these images, where is God? So, you know, the Nazi concentration camp, the Grenfell Tower disaster, flooding, tsunamis, malnutrition, when a child has been killed in a road traffic accident or a shooting. Where is God in those situations? It's a question that theists have to ask themselves, you know, where is God? Why didn't God do something? Why did God allow this to happen? So this is a key question just to introduce us to today's topic. And I think this image here is particularly powerful. It's the former Pope, Pope Benedict XVI, walking through the gates at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where millions of people were gassed to death, innocent men, women, and of course children, gassed to death less than 100 years ago. And I just wonder what is on his mind. You know, the Pope obviously representing, you know, religion, representing the strongest level of faith. Did this test his faith, his belief in an omnibenevolent God, when he walked around this concentration camp and saw where millions of people, innocent people, had been treated so cruelly? They had been tortured and abused and then brutally, horrifically murdered by the Nazis. So yeah, I just thought, again, that gets us thinking about why evil and suffering is a problem for theists, which of course is what this topic is all about. So Two types of evil, guys, that we need to know: natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil, I just want to give you some statistics about this, just, to make it feel a bit more real to us. So natural evil, did you know natural disasters kill on average 45,000 people every single day? 3.1 million children die from poor nutrition and hunger every year. In 2021, there were 401 natural disasters worldwide. I'm just thinking, is that statistic actually correct, that they kill on average 45,000 people every day? Sorry, guys, I'm going to have to do something I shouldn't do and just Google that, because I don't think that statistic is right. Natural disasters, if I'm proved right, then everyone Google it right now, by the way. Let's all do it together. Sorry, this is so unprofessional. We will get on with the session in a minute. Natural disasters kill on average, that should say per year. I knew it. I knew it. Apologies, guys. That should say per year. 45,000 people per year. Excuse me. Sorry, that's terrible of me. I really should check these stats. If you do download the PowerPoint, it will be corrected by the time that it arrives to you. So that should say per year. Sorry, we'll continue. In 2021, there were 401 natural disasters worldwide. Over 6.5 million people have died from COVID-19 since the outbreak began. Thailand's Boxing Day tsunami killed 220,000 people. So one event killed, nearly 250,000 people. And then the 2010 Haiti earthquake killed at least 159,000 people. So that just shows you the devastation that natural evil, natural disasters can cause. And then moral evil, up to 85 million people killed during World War II. 6 million Jews and millions of others were murdered in the Holocaust. Over 400,000 people die from homicide every year. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 20 men have been raped or sexually assaulted. 1 in 6 children, we're told, have been sexually abused. And there are at least 1.5 million theft offences recorded in England and Wales every year. So again, moral evil, giving you some statistics to demonstrate the scale of moral evil and the pain that people suffer as a result of moral evil. So we now need to talk about the two problems. So we're talking today about the problem of evil. There are two different problems we need to know. We need to know the logical problem, and then we need to know the evidential problem. So we're going to start with the logical problem. And this is illustrated by what we call the inconsistent triad. The idea that God is supposedly omnipotent, God is supposedly omnibenevolent, and yet evil exists. And it's the idea that it's logically impossible, hence the fact it's called the logical problem, for all 3 statements on that triangle to be true. One of them must be wrong, and this is why we call it the logical problem. We're not referring to evidence at this point, we're just working with logic. We're working with 3 statements that we're saying cannot all be true. So as it says here, the logical problem is expressed by the inconsistent triad. The idea that God is omnipotent, God is omnibenevolent, and evil exists are 3 statements that cannot all be true. So one of them must be wrong. Now we can trace this all the way back to the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. So of course this was before Christianity and indeed monotheism, but he still had this philosophical problem on his mind. So he asked, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. So he's not loving, he's evil. Is he both able and willing? Then hence evil. So why is there evil is what he's asking there. So this is the logical problem. These 3 statements, they cannot all be true. So how could we solve this problem? How do we solve the problem of evil? We could say God is not omnipotent. So we could say, yeah, one of those 3 statements isn't true. The statement that God is omnipotent isn't true. We could say God's not omnibenevolent. So there's your answer. He is that malevolent God who enjoys seeing his people suffering and going through evil and pain. We could say that evil doesn't exist, yeah, and that's what Augustine will argue. He says evil is a privation, it's an absence of good rather than a thing in itself. Or point number 4, we could say there is a sufficient reason why God allows evil to exist, and that's the free will defense argument, that it is better to have free will and then risk there being evil and suffering than to not have free will. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But these are 4 ways that that logical problem could be solved: by saying that one of those statements is indeed incorrect, or by saying there must be a sufficient reason why an all-powerful and all-loving God would allow evil to exist. So that is our logical problem. We then have our evidential problem, and evidential, remember it as sounding very much like evidence, and it is expressed simply as this: there are known facts about evil that are evidence against the existence of God, and those 2 facts are the following: evil that is overwhelming in quantity and quality, so the extent of evil, and we've just seen that in our statistics, 45,000 people killed in natural disasters every year. Now I've got the statistic correct. So, you know, the fact that there is so much evil and suffering, we can say is evidence, or it is the evidential problem of evil for theists. And then evil that is pointless because it serves no useful purpose. So, you know, we'll talk about the soul-making theodicy, for example, that says evil and suffering exist because they're needed to help people to grow. You know, I always have in my head Kelly Clarkson singing, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Obviously, she's not a scholar we're going to be quoting in the exam, but it helps me to remember that theodicy. But we could say the fact that there is so much evil that is pointless and serves no purpose shows that God can't exist, because he seems to have created pointless suffering. So there's absolutely no justification for it. So here are 2 case studies I want to share with you to help illustrate this problem. The first one is called the Great Dying, which I did not know about until I studied this A-level. So it was an event that supposedly happened 252 million years ago, when 90% of marine species and fish and 79% of land species disappeared, probably through different natural disasters. So, you know, practically all life on the planet was wiped out. It was a great dying. And the NASA website describes this event as almost a perfect crime. Some perpetrator or perpetrators committed murder on a scale unequaled in the history of the world. So the Great Dying obviously illustrating how there is evil and suffering that is overwhelming in its quantity and quality. Because of course, we're not just talking about human suffering, are we? You know, if God has created the world and all creatures, why is he making those creatures suffer as well? And then we've got William Rowe's example of a fawn in a forest. Suppose that in some distant forest, a lightning strike causes a forest fire. A fawn, so it like a young deer, is trapped in the fire, horribly burned, and lies in agony for several days before dying. The fawn's agony appears to be pointless. It suffers and dies alone, and this act does not lead to any greater good whatsoever. It's not like, you know, the animal had to die so someone could eat, or, you know, somebody saw it and could learn from it, and, you know, it compelled them to become an animal vet who would rescue animals from this fate in the future. It has no purpose whatsoever. So they are 2 case studies to illustrate those 2 statements that represent for us the evidential problem of evil. Another point I need to bring in here is then omniscience. So with the logical problem, we spoke, didn't we, about omnipotence and omnibenevolence. When it comes to the evidential problem, I want us to refer to God's omniscience. And the question is this: if God knew how much overwhelming and purposeless evil would occur, why did God bother to create the universe? Why would he create the universe knowing how much suffering was going to be caused? So that leads us to question God's omniscience. Okay, so now we've worked our way through those key attributes of God that we know from paper 2, and you know, we've really used them to highlight the problem of evil and suffering for theists. Okay, so if you are following through on the PowerPoint, this is now an opportunity to do a quick knowledge check. I like to do a knowledge check just to consolidate our understanding. So now is the time for you to think, what is the evidential problem of evil and what is the logical problem of evil? Can you define them, and can you give me an example for each? For example, the Great Dying, the fawn in a fire. So the link is in the description box for you there. We are now then going to move on to looking at the theodicy. So how do theists defend God in the face of the logical and evidential problems? So how do they respond? How do they defend God? That, of course, is what theodicy means. So we are going to work through these three here. We're going to look at the free will defense. We'll look at an explanation of it and the key scholars. We'll then look at the strengths of this theodicy and the weaknesses. We will then do the same for the soul-making theodicy and then the process theology theodicy. That is a mouthful. Okay, so that's what we're doing now. Again, if you're following through with the PowerPoint, you're very welcome to then print this slide. Maybe you can use this as part of your note-taking and your revision. But we are starting with our first theodicy. Very exciting. I need some green tea and celebration, which is the free will defense. So let me just make that box a little bit smaller. There we go. Now we can actually read it. So what is the free will defense? It is the argument that God has given humans free will to bring about a greater good. And that is your key phrase here, greater good. And here is the key point. A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no creatures at all. No creatures? Excuse me, I'm making up words. No free creatures at all. So the point is, a world containing free creatures, or a world where there is free will, is more valuable, it is a better world than a world where there are no free creatures. So this is why it's called the free will defense, because free will is seen as the greater good that justifies the existence of evil and suffering, because it's the idea that you could not have free will if there was not evil and suffering, or the risk of evil and suffering. Okay, so here's a couple of quotes that illustrate this. St. Augustine said that a runaway horse is better than a stone. So the idea that a horse that has freedom and has run away is better than just having a stone, just being stuck, just being programmed and conditioned to act in a certain way. I love that quote. I'd really recommend you revise that quote, get it on a post-it note, stick it on the wall. A runaway horse is better than a stone. And also C.S. Lewis, who I think wrote the Narnia book, didn't he? He's been busy, hasn't he? You didn't know he was a theologian as well. There you go, bit of trivia next time you're watching The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. He said free will, though it makes evil possible, also makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. So we could not have goodness without free will, which means that we have to then also have the risk of evil and suffering. So here's where we're going to start. Those who defend the free will defense have two things to prove: that free will necessarily leads to moral evil, that it is not possible to have free will and not moral evil in the world. So we have to show that if you allow people to have free will, there is a risk that they will use that in the wrong way. And we also have to show that the results of having free will are worth the price. So is it really worth having free will if it means we're going to have all of that evil and suffering in the world? Is it worth it? Why not just make us robots if we're then never going to have to suffer? So it's that balancing act. A couple more quotes. So Richard Swinburne says, the less God allows men to bring about large-scale horrors, the less freedom and responsibility he gives them. So in order to give us freedom and responsibility, God had to risk us being able to cause chaos, cause destruction, you know, do evil and cause suffering. So that was part of the package. He could not give us freedom, which was the most loving thing for him to do, if he didn't also then take on the risk we would use that freedom in the wrong way. And then Alvin Plantinga, who is going to be our key scholar for the free will defense, said, the actualization of a world containing moral good is not just up to God alone. It also depends upon what the significantly free creatures of the world would do. So ultimately, God's role has been to give us freedom. He's given us the freedom and responsibility. It is then over to us. So it's then our responsibility whether the world is filled with goodness, which is obviously what God hopes and what he's encouraging, or evil and suffering. So this is a great chance to bring in a key text for you. Alvin Plantinga wrote a book called God, Freedom and Evil, which nicely summarizes just in the title alone the key points he makes in this free will defense. So Here's a little visual for you to illustrate how the free will defense works. Now, this idea of first order, second order, third order, and fourth order goods is actually proposed by a critic of the defense. So we get this from John Mackie. Now, John Mackie does not like the defense. We're going to see his criticism in a minute, but he sort of is the best person, if you like, in terms of representing it in this way. So John Mackie, in order to criticize the defense, has to explain what it is. And this is his way of explaining it. So the free will defense says that we could not have happiness, pleasure, sympathy, understanding, kindness, compassion, love, generosity, self-sacrifice. We could not have any of these good things without freedom. They have to be freely chosen in order to have value. If they're not freely chosen by us, then why are we being rewarded for them? Why are they being seen as good? Because you know, they're being done automatically. It's about, you know, it's a bit like congratulating, I don't know, congratulating a machine for doing what it's been programmed to do. Well, of course it's going to do that, you know, whereas if you have freedom, it gives these good things, it gives them value, it gives them meaning. But of course, the whole point is, if you have freedom, that means you have choices. And so in the same way, you then have the choice to do good, to pursue happiness and pleasure, show sympathy, understanding, and kindness, you then also have the choice to do the opposites. Yeah. So you have the choice, or there is the possibility, I should say, for spite, meanness, envy, jealousy, greed, and selfishness, for unhappiness, pain, and what is the word that I've hidden there? Let's find out. And misery. There you go. So in order for the things on the left, in order for the goods to have meaning and value, there has to be the risk of the evils, because that is what freedom requires. Freedom is ultimately the greater good than anything else. It is freedom that then gives value to everything else. It gives meaning to everything else. And then, of course, freedom comes from God. So God gives us the freedom. Freedom is therefore that greater good. And then you have, as a result, the opportunity for those first order and second order goods, but equally that comes with the risk of the first order and second order evils. So here's Mackie's summary. God is justified in allowing evil in the universe because it permits the freedom to choose or reject the good. It teaches us to be morally responsible and gives meaning to moral goodness. So as I say, you know, those second order goods that we value in society and we praise in society, and indeed in religion, in the Bible, you know, we're saying they will be rewarded with eternal life. Well, you can only reward it if it's been freely chosen. If you are programmed to do it, then of course you're going to do it. Whereas if it's been chosen, that gives it value, that gives it meaning. But in order for it to be a choice, there has to be an opposite choice as well. Yeah, I can't say, where shall we go on holiday? To Spain or to Spain. You know, you have to give the choice, don't you, in order for that choice to have meaning, if that makes sense. Now, this now allows me to introduce to you the two key concepts of the free will defense, because Alvin Plantinga, who is our key scholar for this defense, says that there are two morally sufficient reasons. And the first one is the point we have just made, that free will is the greater good. And we've just said that, haven't we? We've just seen that in our lovely little visual. So Alvin Plantinga says free will is the greater good. This is the first morally sufficient reason that God allows evil and suffering to exist. And here is the key quote, okay? God's creation of persons with morally significant free will is something of tremendous value. So it has tremendous value. He says God could not eliminate much of the evil and suffering in this world without thereby eliminating the greater good of having persons with free will, with whom he could have relationships and who are able to love one another and do good deeds. So love only has meaning, you know, good deeds only have value because they are freely chosen. That is what gives them value. So free will is something of tremendous value. It is the greater good. And of course, that means God cannot eliminate much of the evil and suffering, because he would, in the process, eliminate the greater good of free will. Because if he gets rid of the evil and suffering, then he eliminates the free will. Okay, so free will is the greater good. That is Alvin Plantinga's defense numero uno. Okay, number one. He then has a second defense, which is for natural evil. So the first defense we've just heard there is about free will, and it's the idea that moral evil is explained because free will is the greater good. God is loving. He has given you free will as an act of love. So that explains moral evil. But then what about natural evil? Well, natural evil, says Plantinga, was caused by humans as well. How did that happen? How did we cause earthquakes and tsunamis? Well, he says, and this is very similar to what Augustine says, by the way, that natural evil is caused by Adam and Eve. And here's the key quote from his book. God allowed natural evil to enter the world as part of Adam and Eve's punishment for their sin in the Garden of Eden. So Adam and Eve in Genesis are responsible for natural evil because their act, their original sin, brought about the fall, didn't it? They ate from that tree. Scandalous, I know. And that act brought about a disharmony between heaven and earth. And as a result, there is suffering, there is natural evil, tsunamis, earthquakes, pain in childbirth, for example. So natural evil, he says, may be the result of original sin, which brought about disharmony. And that is the responsibility of Adam and Eve. Now, you could say, well, why am I paying the price for Adam and Eve's actions in Genesis? You know, what's that all about? How is that fair that God is punishing me for him eating an apple in a garden? But that is the explanation given, that God has allowed natural evil to enter the world as part of Adam and Eve's punishment for their sin in the Garden of Eden. Yeah, and as we know, that event really significant for Christians. Adam is seen as bringing sin into the world, and then it is Jesus who then redeems people of their sin. So really important for Christian theology in general. Now, I want to give you a criticism of this, because Mackie, who we've already mentioned, rejects this defense. And his rejection is quite interesting, okay, because Mackie says that actually there is no reason that if God is giving people free will, that means he has to allow them to choose evil and suffering. So here's what Mackie says. He says, if God has made men such that their free choices, they sometimes... No, I'm going to say that again because I've missed out an important word. He said, let me start again. He said, if God has made men such that in their free choices, they sometimes prefer what is good and sometimes what is evil, why could he not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? Now, that's your key quote for Mackie. He says, always freely choose the good. He thinks it would have been possible for God to create human beings so that they have free will, but then they always freely choose the good. Now, I don't know about you, but that does not sound like free will to me, that you have free will so that you always freely choose something. Now, to me, that's a bit of a contradiction. That is logically impossible, to be forced to always freely choose something. Doesn't really make sense, does it? It's a bit like saying to a child, you know, you can choose between the carrot sticks and the chocolate bar. You must have the carrot sticks, you know, to guarantee the child always makes the same choice. But this is Mackie's argument, okay? So we're going to give it some airtime. He says it is logically possible for a person to make free good choices all of the time. Now, to be fair, you know, there are some very saintly people in this world. So perhaps for some people, yes, it is logically possible for them to make free, good choices all of the time. I can see that being possible. But then he says, God could have created humans so they would only make free, good choices. So God could have created people so they only made free, good choices, that they always freely choose the good. Now, this is where I personally struggle as an RE student, because that doesn't sound like free will to me. And Mackie rightly says God evidently did not do so. Therefore, he says either God lacks the power to create people who always freely choose the good, So God doesn't have the power to always freely to create people who always freely choose the good, or God is not loving enough to do so, and so he's not omnibenevolent. Either way, Mackie says the free will defense fails. Therefore, God does not exist, because God can either not be omnipotent or omnibenevolent, and therefore God does not exist. So the key quote again is that Mackie says God could have chosen to make people so that they always freely choose the good. So it is possible to have free will and always choose goodness. Therefore, there could be free will and no evil and suffering. He believes that is possible, that is feasible, that humans could have free will and there could be no evil and suffering. The free will defense is obviously saying that's not possible, that if you have free will, then you are going to have evil and suffering, but free will is a greater good. Mackie is saying, no, you can have your cake and eat it, essentially. And in the green box there, it sort of summarizes his point. He said, the obviously better possibility of making beings who would act freely, but always go right. So that's a great little soundbite you could use, isn't it? That he says, it's better to have made beings who would always act freely, they would have free will, but always go right. So they've got freedom to always choose the same thing. Now, I want to criticize the criticism here, which is great to do at A level, by saying this criticism does not make sense. It is a flawed criticism because, how can you always freely choose the good? How can you create people so that they always freely choose something? Surely there is some compromise on the free will. So just a criticism of the criticism you may like to consider. And indeed, Plantinga himself is not happy about that criticism. So here's his response to Mackie, his defense of his free will defense, if you like. So he said it would be impossible to casually determine, I think that's meant to say causally determine human actions, to causally determine human actions and at the same time allow them to be morally free. So Mackie is wrong, Plantinga is saying, because it would be impossible to determine human actions so they always choose the good and at the same time allow them to be morally free. So he said free will is morally important. That means that a world in which human beings possess free will is superior to a hypothetical world in which they do not. If human beings were forced to do nothing but good, that would represent a denial of human free will. So that's a great criticism of Mackie's criticism. It would be a denial of human free will. God must bring into being the best possible world that he is able to. It must therefore follow that God must create a world with free will. God is not responsible if humans choose to do evil. God is operating under self-imposed constraints that mean God will not compel human beings to do good. So God has limited himself in order to allow us free will. And that is because, as Augustine says, a runaway horse is better than a stone. He is ready to risk his people going off track and doing the wrong thing because as a loving father, he wants to give them freedom. So that is him choosing to limit his omnipotence in order to maximize his omnibenevolence, to do the loving thing. It's a little bit like the parable of the lost son, for example, that the son goes off and spends all his father's money. There has to be that risk that you will do that because God is like a loving father. So there's Plantinga's defense of his defense, if that makes sense. Now, I want to now move on to your AO2 points. So we're going to look at some of the strengths of the free will defense, and then we'll look at some of the weaknesses as well. So here's your first strength that you could use in a 15 marker for the free will defense. A world with genuine free will, we can say, is much more valuable than one without, where humans are in effect robots. And this is your point from Augustine, that a runaway horse is better than a stone. Plantinga asserts that God has created the best of all possible worlds. This is the best of all possible worlds he could have created. Therefore, this world contains free will because this is much more valuable than one without it. So in order for it to be the best of all possible worlds, there has to be free will. As St. Augustine wrote, a runaway horse is better than a stone. Evil and suffering is therefore the price that is paid for the greater good of genuine free will. So we can say a strength of it is that it is a more valuable world than one without, that we can agree with that, that makes sense, that humans cannot be robots. It gives the world more value. So that is to reinforce and support the free will defense. We could also say a strength is that it satisfactorily explains moral evil. The criminal justice system works on the assumption that the free will defense is making that we have free will, hence the title, free will defense. So we could say this defense satisfactorily explains the existence of moral evil as the result of human free choices. This is consistent with the legal system, which holds people accountable for what are understood as freely chosen actions. You know, when you go to court, you are being held to account for choosing to murder someone or choosing to steal or whatever it is you're in court for. That is the assumption that's made by our legal system, isn't it? We're jailing people, we're punishing people because we believe that they are criminally liable, they are responsible for their actions. So our legal system is based on the assumption that people do have free will. So we can say it satisfactorily explains moral evil. It is consistent with the criminal justice system, we can say. People are held criminally liable for their actions, suggesting they are personally responsible for them. So we can say that in the modern world, this theodicy is consistent with popular opinion, with conventional beliefs, as seen in the criminal justice system. This is an assumption that we make in society today, that people do have free will, therefore they are responsible for their actions and the consequences of them. So that is absolutely a strength of this theory in the modern world. And there's Judge Judy. I just thought she might like to make an appearance if we're talking about the legal system. Okay, what's another strength then? So we could say that the defense is consistent with St. Augustine's traditional teachings on the cause of natural evil. So, you know, we've just said it's consistent with modern thinking on free will and criminal responsibility. We are now going to say it's actually got really good historical gravitas. It's got really good historical support because we're going back in time to one of the most important Christian theologians, to St. Augustine, who is one of the most influential Christian theologians in history, because he is our key thinker when it comes to this idea of original sin and the fall. So St. Augustine would absolutely endorse Plantinga's free will defense here in terms of that second point about natural evil being caused by the fall. So a couple of scholars have got here. So Malcolm said that for Augustine, natural evils such as diseases are divinely ordained consequences of a primeval fall. So, you know, Augustine supported the idea that the fall caused natural evil. So this free will defense is rooted in Christian history. It has the support of one of our heavyweights of Christian thinking, of one of our key theologians and scholars from Christian history. And Rosenberg as well said for Augustine, all of nature is afflicted and disrupted by the fall of Adam and Eve, which imposed a penalty on all of the natural world, altering its course and structure. The physical world was perfect and without sources of pain and suffering before the pair broke the law. So again, we've got this idea that Plantinga has support from a key theologian of the past, one of these key beliefs of Christianity about the fall, about original sin, which is still, you know, very popular amongst many Christian groups today. So we can say it's supported on the moral evil front, and it's also supported on the natural evil front. Okay. Let's keep going then, because we now need to see some weaknesses of this theory. So we could say a weakness of the free will defense is that some people believe it does not sufficiently explain the existence of natural evil. So I said before, didn't I? How can Adam and Eve be the reason that children are starving to death today? Because they ate an apple from a tree, why on earth are thousands of people being killed in world wars and in, you know, these terrible, terrible, devastating catastrophes? So here's our weakness. Here's our criticism. We could say natural disasters are not caused by human beings. They cannot be held morally responsible or liable for hurricanes, tsunamis, and earthquakes. We can say Plantinga's explanation which is also Augustine's explanation, requires a literalist reading of Genesis. It requires you believe that what happened in Genesis literally happened, that they literally were put in that garden, that they ate from that tree, and that act historically happened and then has consequences for billions of people for thousands of years. That's what this requires. Now, we can say for many theists, Genesis is seen as being literally historically true, but for many, it is seen as metaphorically true. You know, not every theist, I would say the majority of theists, don't believe that Genesis is literally true. You know, we know from our study of Christianity and science, for example, you know, people like Pope Francis think that the world was created via the Big Bang and that humans were created through the process of evolution. You know, there is no belief that the events in Genesis are literally true. They're seen as metaphorically true. It's seen as a spiritual truth. It's seen as an important story with an important message, but it's not seen as literally true. And so if you don't believe that story is literally true, you aren't going to accept Plantinga's point here that Adam and Eve caused all of the natural evil. Because if that event did not historically happen, then there's a problem with the whole theory, isn't there? So it appears the defense cannot account for all types of evil, and so is an unsatisfactory defense. Okay, another weakness for you now. It is based on the assumption that we have free will. This has not been proven. So this is where that keyword determinism is going to come in. So anyone also doing A-level psychology will also be able to tell us a little bit more about this. So the free will defense relies on the libertarian account of free will. This is the assumption we have free will. So there is continued debate around this assumption. Psychologists and neuroscientists continue to study this question and have no definitive answer. Now, determinists believe that we do not have free will. And so that would undermine the success of this defense. If it's actually found in a few years' time by psychologists that humans don't have free will, then this whole defense would be undermined, wouldn't it? Because there is no free will that is there as a greater good. So we can say that the entire theodicy is based on the assumption that we have free will. Because this has not been proven, because there is an ongoing debate about determinism and libertarianism, that we cannot say it is 100% accurate, because there is the problem, it's built on an assumption. So it could therefore undermine the success of the defense as providing a credible theodicy, a credible defense, because the jury is still not out on free will, which is the whole point of this defense, isn't it? And then another point, we're going to look at the evidential problem in particular here. And we're going to say, considering the amount of evil and suffering, is free will really worth it? So we keep on saying, don't we, you know, free will is the price we have to pay. It is the greater good. It is so important. It is so valuable. It is so amazing. It is given to us as an act of love. For a runaway horse is better than a stone. We keep saying that. But is that the case? Is free will really worth its price tag? Considering, the extent of evil and suffering in the world, it is not clear whether freedom is really worth so much pain. At the point of creation, we could say God must have known the full extent of human evil if he had that omniscience. So why did he bother to create such a universe where there would be so much evidential evil? Why has he done that? You know, what is the reason for that? Surely it would have been better to not create the universe at all than to create a universe where things would go so wrong and there would be so much evil and suffering. So again, that can be another weakness. Is free will really worth it? Considering that evidential problem in particular, a great key term to refer to in your answer. Okay, let's move on to our second theodicy now. This is Hick and his soul-making theodicy. So this is your second defense. Now, important for understanding Hick's soul-making theodicy is an understanding of some ancient theodicies. Okay, so Hick very sadly died in 2012, so he was a much more contemporary thinker, but we trace the roots of his theodicy all the way back to someone called Saint Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus was going head to head, metaphorically, with Saint Augustine, who we have already met today. So I want to start by telling you about Saint Augustine and Saint Irenaeus, and that will then help us to understand John Hick and his theodicy. Okay, it's going very dark, by the way, guys. I've got rain now pouring down. Just thought I'd tell you that. It's gone very dark, but don't worry. The Amazon fairy lights are going to keep us illuminated this afternoon. So we're going to carry on. We're going to persevere. You might not be able to see me by the end of the video, but you know what? That's probably not a bad thing. So St. Augustine and his soul-deciding theodicy. He believed, as we've said, that all humans are born sinful. Very positive, isn't it? It's called original sin because they inherit sin from Adam and Eve, who ate from the tree in the Garden of Eden. So this is the belief, isn't it, that the fall historically happened, that this event literally happened. It historically happened. They were put in that garden, they ate that fruit, and that has had consequences for billions of people for thousands of years. And so this explains for Augustine the cause of evil and suffering, humanity. He believed we therefore depend on God's grace, so on God's love, in order to be saved from our sin. And this is in the form of Jesus Christ's atoning crucifixion on the cross. So for St. Augustine, none of us are worthy of salvation because we are all fallen. We inherit original sin. And so we depend on God and his grace and on Jesus. We cannot earn our own salvation. We cannot do that because we are fallen. We are intrinsically sinful because we inherit sin, original sin, from Adam and Eve. Whereas St. Irenaeus, here he is, he fundamentally disagreed with Augustine. He argued against this idea that there was a fall. He said humans did not fall from perfection. He says instead, God intentionally created us imperfect. So we are actually created imperfect. And this is because throughout our lives in this world, we will grow into perfect beings who are capable of entering heaven if we follow the teachings and examples set by Jesus Christ, the main man of Christianity. We develop and grow through the soul-making process into children of God. So for Irenaeus, we did not fall. We already are down here at the beginning. So there is no fall, there's no betrayal, there's no fall from grace. And therefore, we start imperfect on purpose. There is a point to it, because then in life, through our experiences in this world, we will grow, we will develop. Obviously, we will grow biologically, but he believes we will grow spiritually and morally. So, you know, through our experiences in this world, we will learn, we will grow, we'll become stronger, we'll become kinder, more loving, and ultimately we will become worthy of entering heaven. And this inspired John Hick, who, as you can see here, was a key 20th century theologian. So, as I've put here, John Hick is inspired by Saint Irenaeus, who argued that humans are intentionally created imperfect by God as part of his plan, and then have to, and I love this phrase, rise to perfection and work towards achieving the likeness of God during their lives on earth. So he believed that the world is a place of soul making, okay? And in order to be this school for the soul, where our souls can be made, if you like, it has to contain the full range of moral and natural evils so that humans can develop virtues such as courage, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Yeah, think about it. If we never encountered suffering, if we never encountered pain and difficult things, we would never have to develop these virtues. We would never need them, would we? You don't need compassion if you're not seeing someone who's suffering. If everything's perfect all of the time, there is no opportunity to develop those key virtues that the Bible, the New Testament says will be rewarded with eternal life. So we need to have evil and suffering. We need to have that full range of moral and natural evil so that we can develop virtues in response, that we can then do all of the good things that the New Testament teaches us to do. He said these second order virtues are the qualities by which we become children of God. Our suffering, and importantly, our response to it, makes us virtuous and Christ-like. And the really important line I want you to remember, again, get it on a post-it note, is that evil and suffering are instrumental, in that, you know, you use an instrument to make a sound, don't you? Or you use an instrument as a means to an end. Evil and suffering are a means to an end. They are needed as a catalyst, as a tool, in order to help us to grow, to become Christ-like, to be good people. In response to them, we perform the good works, the good deeds that the New Testament teaches us about. And so a great quote from the New Testament could be this. Jesus says, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So you need to carry your cross. You need to follow in Jesus's footsteps. If you look at Jesus's life, it was all about healing people, helping the poor, empowering people. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful, the 7 works of mercy in the parable of the sheep and the goats. The whole point of being a good Christian is helping people and alleviating their suffering. And so you need to see that suffering in order to respond to it. So he emphasizes the idea of God as a father. And he says a father cannot force his children to love him. Instead, children love their parents through a free response to their parents' care. Parents develop their children's character by teaching them how to live responsibly within the world. So we freely choose to love God, and he gives us a world in which we can learn the value of love and the value of goodness. So again, it's this idea of a veil of soul making. It's like a school. In a school, you need to do all the different subjects, don't you, in order to become a well-rounded student who can then graduate and go out into the world and be successful. For Hick, the world needs to be filled with all different moral and natural evils in order for us to grow, in order for us to develop. Now, he's a universalist who believes that all people will eventually be saved. Everybody will ultimately be brought into a moral and spiritual relationship with God. And so everybody, because everybody lives through this veil of soul making, will ultimately become worthy of salvation. It's not like with Augustine, where there's this idea of predestination or election. Everybody is starting from the same point. Everybody is then growing. They are rising to perfection. They are developing their soul. They are strengthening their characters, and they will ultimately be saved. So epistemic distance, remember that key term from the start of our session? Hick believes that God set an epistemic distance between himself and humanity. This is a distance in knowledge, so that humans cannot know for sure there is a God. So he believed God intentionally created a distance between himself and humanity. Why is that? Well, it's so that there is therefore a lot we don't understand, such as why evil and suffering exist. This is important because it means that having a relationship with God is a choice, reflecting the fact a loving relationship is only authentic and valuable if it is freely chosen. So there is an epistemic distance. There is a lot we don't understand. We cannot know for sure that God exists. There has to be this epistemic distance to give meaning and value to our relationship with God. If there was no epistemic distance, that relationship would not have value. Our commitment to him, our faith in him, I should say, would not have any value. So they are Hick's key points. Now, I've got for you here some of the key quotes from him, which sort of underpin, if you like, all of those arguments we've just spoken about. You don't need to memorize them all. If you have got the PowerPoint to hand, you might want to print this off maybe, and then just highlight, a few 4 or 5 words from each that you might like to use as a soundbite in your essay, just to refer in your exam to the primary sources of Hick. That just shows your examiner you're an A-star student. So, for example, he says, our world is not designed for the maximization of human pleasure and the minimization of human pain. It may nevertheless be rather well adapted to the quite different purpose of soul making. So the point of this world is not happiness and pain. The point of this world is for you to develop your soul. So we need to realize what the point of this world is. In order to be a person exercising some measure of genuine freedom, the creature must be brought into existence, not in the immediate divine presence, but at a distance from God. So a little bit like the free will defense, isn't it? So the idea here is that we must have epistemic distance in order to have genuine freedom. In order for us not to be conditioned to believe in God and worship God, we need to have that distance. There needs to be some doubt. It needs to be a matter of faith. If we ask whether the business of soul making is worth all the toil and sorrow of human life, the Christian answer must be in terms of a future good, great enough to justify all that has happened on the way to it. So Hick's point here is that the purpose of life is to attain salvation. So all this suffering that you're going through is temporary. It's for an eternal goal, for life in heaven, to be saved and to go to heaven. So this is the idea that you've got to focus on the ultimate outcome, that the whole soul-making process ends with an amazing reward, with an amazing destination. And of course, for Hick as the universalist, you know, everybody will ultimately get there. So the end does justify the means, to use a term from utilitarianism, which we study later on paper 1. He also says human beings were brought into existence as intelligent creatures endowed with the capacity for immense moral and spiritual development. They are not the perfect pre-fallen Adam and Eve of the Augustinian tradition, but immature creatures at the beginning of a long process of growth. So he's acknowledging here that his theodicy is at odds with Augustine's, yeah? Because Augustine was saying we are fallen, whereas Hick and Irenaeus are saying that actually we start off imperfect and then we go through this journey, we go through this process of development, you know, where we are at the beginning of a long process of growth, to use his primary quote there. And then finally, he says, God has set us in a world containing unpredictable contingencies and dangers, in which unexpected and undeserved calamities may occur to anyone. Because, he says, here's the important bit, only in such a world can mutual caring and love be elicited. So for us to become genuinely caring and genuinely loving, there has to be unpredictable contingencies and dangers, because there has to be this uncertainty, this element of danger, this element of surprise, if you like, in order for our love and our care to have value and meaning. We need to be living in that uncertain and at times unstable world in order for those moral goods and those morally good values to have real meaning. Okay, so just some primary quotes to underpin Hick's thinking. What are the strengths then of his theodicy? Well, the first point I'd make is about the epistemic distance. And I would say that the epistemic distance can justify pretty much any kind of evil. So we've got a bit of, you know, a one size fits all kind of response here, because you can just literally say any kind of evil is beyond our understanding. So he, you know, he can say that the epistemic distance justifies any form of evil, including animal suffering and apparently pointless suffering. The distance between humanity and God means our knowledge is limited. His thesis that the end is heaven justifies the means. So he can just say there is a gap in our knowledge. We don't understand why that evil and suffering exists. We can't know that. That's the whole point of the epistemic distance. So you could say, you know, it's a brilliant coverall response that he can use. So that is a way of defending his theodicy from any criticisms. Even for pointless suffering, we can say, well, you know, that's part of the epistemic distance. God has to create pointless suffering we don't understand to maintain that epistemic distance. Excuse me, I've said that word too many times now. Another strength then, we can say, of course, it is consistent with St. Irenaeus and his ideas about the purpose of evil. So we can say it is grounded in St. Irenaeus's ancient theodicy. So, you know, we can contextualize this theodicy in the bigger picture, in that broader sphere of Christian theology. So Hick's theodicy has roots in the thinking of Irenaeus and Origen. Sorry, I just thought of that TikTok. That TikTok where, what's the name, is going around shouting roots. Anyway, we digress. Hick's contemporary theodicy is grounded in Irenaeus's 2nd century thinking. He believed that the purpose of God creating this world was soul making for rational moral agents. We are not created perfectly, but in a state of imperfection, so that we may rise to perfection. In order to achieve the likeness of God described in Genesis, we must be refined and developed. Humans are a work in progress. So actually, I would say that it's grounded in Irenaeus' 2nd century thinking, which gives it that historical validity and credibility. But also, that's a very popular idea in, modern culture, isn't it? We see a lot of these quotes online that you're a work in progress, I'm a work in progress. That's actually a very popular contemporary idea as well in the modern world. So it's got the weight and gravitas of being backed up by St. Irenaeus and his ideas from thousands of years ago. So showing that this theodicy, can trace its roots back in Christian history. It's got that gravitas and credibility. But also, it's still a very relevant idea in the world today that we're a work in progress, that nobody's perfect. That's a very popular idea, isn't it? I think that's a Jessie J song. If I continue with my pop culture references today, I won't start singing though, don't worry. So yeah, with these theodicies, a really good way to outline their strengths is to talk about any historical scholars who have said something that backs them up, and also any contemporary ideas that show why this theodicy would be relevant or appealing for people in the modern world. Okay, and then another strength is that it's consistent with evolution, isn't it? And the idea that humans develop over time. So obviously evolution is a biological thing, and the theodicy is talking about your spiritual evolution, but we can say that, they are similar, they are consistent. And so it makes sense that human beings would evolve, to use the word itself, in this way. So Darwin's theory of evolution teaches that humans physically developed over time. Similarly, Hicks' theodicy teaches that our souls develop over time. It makes sense that humans are a work in progress. And I've actually put there, this is an idea that has taken hold in popular culture. This idea we are not born as a finished product. For example, in the education system, you don't go into year 1 and your teacher assumes that you know Pythagoras' theorem and that you know every Latin word or whatever, that is not the case. We assume you are born tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and that you are kind of like a vessel to be filled with knowledge that you will develop academically over time. So we can say it makes sense because evolution assumes this biological development, education assumes this academic development. We can say it makes sense, it is consistent for Hick to say we then have this spiritual and moral development, that we learn that as well in this veil of soul making that we live in. So that would be another strength that is consistent with that idea of development over time. And one more strand. Oh, I really like this theory, don't I? And it is this: the idea of universal salvation is compatible with beliefs about God's omnibenevolence. So Hick's theodicy teaches that we will all ultimately achieve God's likeness and the perfection necessary to enter heaven. This is known as universalism. Everybody will ultimately be saved. We can say that it's more benevolent than Augustine's soul deciding theodicy, where everybody is born into sinfulness, but only a selective few will be saved. So we can say this theodicy presents God as all loving because everyone will ultimately be saved. However, a problem that you could then bring in here, a response, a rebuttal, which will, show the examiner again, you're an A-star candidate, is actually, is it really worth it? Is it really the case that God must be all loving? Because if God is saying you've got to go through all of this pain and suffering in order to achieve eternal salvation, is that really fair? Why couldn't God just give us eternal salvation or eternal life and not make us go through all this suffering? Why do we need to go through that? Why couldn't he have created us as a finished product? You could say, why do some people have to go through so much more suffering than others? One person's suffering is that they don't have as many TikTok followers as Charlie D'Amelio, whereas another person's suffering is that they're living in a war zone, all their family have been killed and they're starving to death themselves. Why is suffering so unequal? It's so unfair. So we could say, if we're all going to the same place afterwards, why are different people experiencing different levels of suffering? So that could be a response there. Is it really worth it? you know, does the end really justify the means? And that actually does lead me on to the weaknesses. A nice little segue there. Always make sure that your essays are leading the examiner along on the journey. See what I did there? A bit of exam technique for you. So we could say the theory does not justify pointless suffering. The whole point of this theodicy is that all suffering serves a purpose because it helps us to grow, that it's instrumental. But actually, we could say there is some suffering that appears completely pointless. For example, animal suffering, yeah? The fawn in a forest that we spoke about before, William Rowe. What is the point of that? It doesn't help me to grow. The animal's not going to go to heaven because it's died a painful, agonizing death. What is the point of it? Hicks' response, of course, is epistemic distance, that pointless suffering, including the suffering experienced by animals, is needed to maintain the epistemic distance between humanity and God. It is needed to keep us questioning. There needs to be things we don't understand that don't make sense to us in order to maintain the epistemic distance, which allows for the greater good of us freely choosing to love God. The epistemic distance, we could say, is also supported by the fall, which suggests there is a separation between humanity and God. Although, of course, Hick doesn't agree with the fall. You know, this is a popular idea in Christianity that there is that gap between God and humanity. There is a separation between heaven and earth. Michelangelo's painting, for example, of God and Adam reaching out to one another, but not quite meeting. So there is this idea, there is a separation. But just to bring it back to the weakness, it doesn't justify pointless suffering. The whole point of the theory is that suffering has a purpose, that it is instrumental, and that's why it's permitted. But what about the pointless suffering? So yeah, I think that's a valid weakness. DZ Phillips has an excellent point to make here. He says the theory does not justify the, excuse me, let me just minimize myself, the quantity of evil in the world. He says, does the end really justify the means? And he thinks not. So DZ Phillips argues that you cannot see evil and suffering as instrumental for a greater good. We should not use other people's suffering as a means to an end. So we should not think, I'm so glad that all those people have been, you know, left homeless and starving and in need as a result of that tsunami, because now I can develop my soul by donating to a charity to help them. Aren't I a lovely person? Thank you, God. Great. That suffering served me well. Now I'm off to heaven. Yeah, he says you cannot speak of moral growth in this way. And that is his key quote. I love that quote. We cannot speak of moral growth in this way. You cannot say that evil and suffering are a catalyst for moral growth. It's insulting to those who suffer. And, you know, it's just a bit embarrassing, really, to think that other people's suffering is your source of salvation, because then you get to be the Good Samaritan. You get to be the saint who helps them. So he says we cannot justify the existence of horrendous evils, such as the Holocaust, by stating that we need to grow deeply in responding to them. Again, insulting to the millions of innocent people killed in the Holocaust and in World War II in general. A little quote that he gives is in the context of cancer, yeah, and the idea that Hick would say cancer is there to help you grow morally in order to enter heaven. He says you can't just say to someone, here you go, a bit of cancer should toughen you up. We can't speak of moral growth in this way. He finds it insulting, he finds it inappropriate, he finds it offensive. The idea that the end justifies the means does not go down well with DZ Phillips. And, you know, always great in your exam to be using examples such as cancer, such as the Holocaust. You know, if you can use these real world examples to illustrate how this theory could be flawed, it could be seen as offensive, insulting, or just inappropriate to speak of moral growth in this way. Now, Hick's response is that all evils are a matter of degree. He would say that if we remove evils like the Holocaust, then the next to worst evils would seem the very worst. If we ask whether the business of soul making is worth all the toil and sorrow of human life, the Christian answer must be in terms of a future good, great enough to justify all that has happened on the way to it. So he maintains that the greater good of heaven justifies all of these hells, all of this suffering, and all of this evil. He maintains that. He says, the end justifies the means. We cannot comprehend the greatness of the good that awaits us in heaven. So that's his defense, that's his rebuttal. But I would still say D.Z. Phillips makes a very strong point that we cannot speak of moral growth in this way. Okay, and just another weakness for you. The idea of universalism, we've already said that's the strength of the theory. It can also be seen as a weakness because it's rejected by some Christians, which arguably undermines Hick's theodicy and its relevance for some Christians. You know, it's not going to be supported by all Christians because they don't all believe in universalism. And that's a nice link to paper 2 when we do talk about religious pluralism. So according to Hick's theodicy, everybody will ultimately be saved. But you could say, as one of your criticisms, as one of your weaknesses, that this raises a lot of important questions for Christians, such as, what is the point of Jesus's sacrificial death and resurrection if everybody can become worthy of salvation on their own anyway? So obviously for Augustine, because of Adam bringing sin into the world, God has to become a man in the form of Jesus in order to save the world. But for Hick, you're just becoming worthy on your own. So for Hick, Jesus is more of a role model. And so we don't actually need his resurrection because we're going to be saved by following Jesus's example rather than saved through his sacrificial death and resurrection. So is that undermining Christianity and Christian belief about the role of Jesus in salvation? What does this mean for traditional doctrines of election and judgment? You know, for example, will people who cause the evil and suffering be saved? Because actually they've done us all a favor, because, you know, if Hitler hadn't behaved in the way he had, we wouldn't have the chance for moral growth. You know, this is where the argument becomes a little bit ridiculous, doesn't it? If everybody's going to be saved, what's the point of being a good person and doing good things? Because actually, Hick is saying evil and suffering are actually good things, that they are instrumental. So I could say, well, actually, I've helped people by causing evil because it gives them a chance to grow morally and have moral and spiritual growth. So aren't I a great person being a mass murderer? What does this mean for the sola Christus principle? So that is a link to pluralism and the idea from theologians such as Karl Barth that it is only through Christ alone that we can be saved. You know, this theory of universalism is that everybody will be saved. So actually, what is the point of Christianity? Beyond Jesus being a nice role model of how to behave, what is actually the point of believing in him? And then if we're all saved anyway, why go through so much suffering? Yeah, if we're all ultimately going to be saved, why do we need all of that suffering in the first place? Can we not just skip this round? Can we not just skip this level of the game and get on with the eternal life if that's what God wants for us anyway? Why must he force us to go through this boot camp of suffering in order to be saved if he's going to save us anyway? And Hick's response is going to be, because you need to develop and grow. You're born imperfect, you then rise to perfection. Oh, and an extra weakness for you, just a little bit of spice for you today, guys. Extra. If humans were made, imago Dei, surely they were made fully perfected. So obviously we keep on saying God created us imperfect. We need evil and suffering in order to grow. It's instrumental, it's important, it's a greater good. We're all going to heaven because we've been through it. It's helped us become these lovely people. But actually, Genesis says humans were made imago Dei. They were made in the image and likeness of God. So hang on, we are perfect. We are made perfect because from the start of Genesis, we're told humans are made in the image of God, in the image and likeness of God. However, this is obviously problematic. So as I've put, surely this means God created humans fully perfect rather than simply with this potential. Hick's response, however, is that Genesis says we are made in the image and likeness of God. He is correct. He's read his Bible. Well done, Hick. He says we are made with his image and then grow into his likeness over time. We are created with potential rather than completion. So obviously this is a question of interpretation, isn't it? This is a question of how you read the text, how you interpret the text. For Hick, it's a matter of interpretation. And his interpretation is that God has created you with the potential to grow into his likeness. So that depends on Hick's interpretation of Genesis. Much like with Alvin Plantinga and Augustine interpreting Genesis as literally true in order for natural evil to be explained, for Hick, it depends on his interpretation of that line in Genesis that we are born with the potential rather than completion. Okay, so if you do download the PowerPoint, you'll be able to just see this visual as well, which is where you can see the three criticisms that the theodicy does not justify animal suffering, pointless evils, or the extent of evil. And then you'll be able to see those arguments that Hick makes in response as well. So that's just there if you do click and download the PowerPoint from the website. Okay, let's move on, shall we, to our third and final theodicy, which is Griffin's idea of process theology. So over to you, David Griffin. What have you got to say? And then we are going to decide which of these theodicies do we think is most successful. So theodicy number 3. Process theology. It's from David Griffin, and it's the idea that God is not transcendent and so cannot intervene to eliminate evil. So process theology is the idea that God is part of the process rather than this omnipotent, transcendent creator. So God is very much involved with the world as the soul of the universe, as opposed to being this removed, omnipotent creator. So, key beliefs in process theology. God did not create the universe out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, and God is not omnipotent. So when it comes to resolving the logical problem of evil, process theology has solved it straight away. Process theology has gone, yeah, correct, God is not omnipotent, but we still believe in him. So the idea here is that God cannot intervene to prevent evil because he is not transcendent and he has not created it. Instead, he is the soul of the universe. He's more like gravity than a granddad, you could say, if that makes sense as an image. And so instead of being the source of evil and suffering, he actually shares in it. So God is affected in the way that we are. God is just as affected by this as we are. So the relationship between God and the universe is what we call panentheistic. The universe exists within God and God exists within the universe. God is the soul of the universe. Both the universe and God exist eternally and uncreated. He didn't create it, he fashioned it from pre-existing matter. So here is some key information about that process. So David Griffin, and by the way, when we're talking about this, do be thinking, guys, does this sound like Christianity to you? Does this sound like what you read about in the Bible and what most Christians believe? Because that's obviously going to be a criticism of the theodicy, that you've actually started talking about a different God entirely. So Griffin says God did not create everything, but simply fashioned pre-existing matter. God is powerful, but not all-powerful. He cannot control the physical aspect of the universe any more than the human mind can control the internal workings of its body. So I think that's quite interesting. You can't think, I would like my stomach to stop grumbling. I would like my heart to beat faster. Your mind cannot control your internal organs, can it? I mean, if it can, let's get you on Britain's Got Talent or something. But as far as I'm aware, you know, you don't have that kind of control. So your mind is still powerful, but it's not all powerful over your body. So God can persuade chaotic matter into organized forms over a long period of time, but God cannot intervene directly. We've got to think of God as more like a soul, as opposed to being this like supernatural granddad, you know, puppet master who's going, oh, I'm going to give them a miracle, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. Doesn't work like that, according to Griffin. And so the evidential problem of evil does not arise, God cannot intervene, and the logical problem doesn't arise, God isn't omnipotent. And so there is simply a long process of divine persuasion. So God can only persuade, he is very much involved, as opposed to being blamed and being the cause. So here is the theodicy. God is not the source of suffering. So there we are. We've resolved the problem. God's not the cause of it. He's not the source of it. Instead, God shares in our suffering. He suffers alongside us as the soul of the universe. So he's still our refuge and he's still a source of support, but he's not the omnipotent creator of all the evil and suffering that exists. The question that you've got to ask, as I've put there on the screen, is, does that actually sound like the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity? Because, of course, these theodicies are supposed to be defending the Christian God. Does this sound like what Christians believe in? Or does this sound like the God Christians believe in, if I try to use some accurate grammar? So what about RAO2? So we could say it's good, it works, because it's a resolution to the logical problem of evil. It establishes that God is not omnipotent. So process theology has an answer to the logical problem of evil. God is not omnipotent. Therefore, it is possible to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of God. God does not have the power to control it. However, here's your counter argument, here's your rebuttal. Omnipotence is seen as one of the key characteristics of God by most theists. It's a key teaching from the Bible, which is seen by Christians as the infallible word of God. And so we have to ask, is this God, is the God of process theology worthy of worship? Is a God who lacks omnipotence actually worthy of worship? So that's got to be the question you're asking. We could say, though, a strength is that it presents God as close to his people because he's so involved in the world in this pantheistic relationship. He is the soul of the universe who shares in their suffering. And of course, we do see that in the Bible when Jesus dies on the cross, that he is sharing in suffering on the cross. But this theory in particular emphasizes his omnibenevolence and closeness. So we can say process theology presents God as sharing in humanity's suffering because he is the soul of the universe and has that pantheistic relationship with it. Therefore, people feel closer to God, which can be a reassurance during times of suffering. It also takes away the blame potentially given to him. He can't be blamed for evil and suffering. Instead, he's sharing in it. So it emphasizes his immanence, his closeness, and also that omnibenevolent aspect. Okay, however, problem for you. If God is not omnipotent, we've got a few problems. So why would God start a process he could not control, especially considering the outcome? So it is not clear why God would intentionally start a process, so why he would start fashioning the universe that he could not control, especially if he has the omniscience to know the ultimate outcome. So even if he's not omnipotent, we still believe he has omniscience. So if he knew how things were going to end up going anyway, why did he go ahead with the process? Why did he start fashioning things in the first place? So why did he go ahead with the process he would lose all power over, he wouldn't have power over, or that would end up leading to so much unnecessary evil and suffering? Now, a rebuttal to that could be, well, God's a victim as well. God suffers alongside humanity, so he has empathy, he has omnibenevolence. And again, that's seen in Jesus, you could say. But again, I think it leads to a question of, what kind of God is this? You know, is this God worthy of worship if God's got no power and can't solve the problem? And so that kind of leads to the ultimate criticism of process theology. And we can say that this process theology theodicy cannot defend the Christian God. So that's sort of our ultimate weakness here. Process theology says that God is not omnipotent and did not create the world out of nothing. And so even though it can defend God from the problem of evil and suffering, this is not consistent with mainstream Christian thinking. Therefore, this theodicy fails to defend the Christian God. So you can say it defends a God, but not the Christian God, because it depends on believing God is not omnipotent, did not create the world out of nothing, and that God is the soul of the universe in this pantheistic relationship, which is ultimately not what the majority of Christians believe. So that would be your ultimate weakness, I would say, of this theodicy. And then, oh, I love this one, actually. This is a really good one from John Ross. This is really powerful. So he said that if God is not omnipotent, he is a weak and pathetic God who is not worthy of worship. So, you know, he's not holding back here, is he? So he said this, by the implications of Griffin's theory, when somebody arrives at Auschwitz, the best that God could possibly have done was to permit 10,000 Jews a day to go up in smoke. A God of such weakness, no matter how much he suffers, is rather pathetic. So even if God is suffering alongside us, he is pathetic. Good though he may be, Griffin's God is too small. So John Ross there saying this God is weak and pathetic. This God is not worthy of worship, because if God can do nothing about the suffering of his people and the suffering in his world, he is not worthy of worship. So just another little shout out for the PowerPoint. If you've not been persuaded to click that link yet, we have got a knowledge check here. So if you are using the PowerPoint, you can fill that in, print it off maybe. Otherwise, just pause this video and just work through those questions and just think, could I answer each of those questions? Do I know what each of those key concepts is? Always great to do a knowledge check as part of our revision. Sorry, someone's now spamming me on WhatsApp. What else have we got? So paper 1 exam style questions for you. Here we go. So examine the logical and evidential problem of evil for 10 marks. So that would just be focusing on the first bits that we did. Or 1B, John Hick's soul-making theodicy gives a satisfactory response to the problem of evil. Evaluate this claim. So that's really focusing on one particular theodicy, but just putting it out there, you could, as part of that answer, say why another theodicy gives a better response, perhaps. But yeah, 1B would very much be giving those strengths and weaknesses of John Hick's soul-making theodicy. And you could obviously try that same style of question for the free will defense and also for the process theology theodicy as well. I do hope that's all been helpful. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do let me know what you think about these theodicies, about these theories. I'm still being spammed on WhatsApp in the comments down below. And yes, have a great day. Good luck with your revision. I hope you're enjoying this A-level. I absolutely love these topics, despite the theme, despite the topic, a bit dark, but hey, have a great day, have a great week, and I hope to see you here on the channel soon. Bye-bye, take care.